Good morning, children. I welcome you all in today's session. Children, today we'll begin with lesson 5, that is learning, and study what learning means and how it takes place. We will also be studying about classical conditioning. So let's begin. First of all, about the meaning and definition of learning. The process of learning is continuous, which starts right from the time of birth of an individual and continues till the death. We all are engaged in learning attempts in order to develop our adaptive capabilities as per the requirements of the changing environment. Children, for learning to occur, two things are very important. First, the presence of a stimulus in the environment, and the second one is the innate dispositions like emotional dispositions and instinctual dispositions. Now, children, innate dispositions are the qualities or characteristics which are acquired before or at the time of birth, and the emotional dispositions, they are the persistent tendency to feel an emotion. A person keeps on learning across all the stages of life by constructing or reconstructing experiences under the influence of emotional and instinctual dispositions. Learning can be defined as a permanent modification, that is, change of behavior as a result of past experience and practice. This definition of learning stresses on three important elements of learning. First, learning involves a behavioral change which can be better or worse. Next, this behavioral change should take place as a result of practice and experience. Changes resulting from maturity or growth, they cannot be considered as learning. Next, this behavioral change must be relatively permanent and it should last for a relatively longer time. Now, children, J.B. Watson, the founder of the behavioral school of thought, is one amongst the first thinker who has proven that behavioral changes occur as a result of learning. Gales defined learning as the behavioral modification which occurs as a result of experience as well as training. Boas defined learning as the process by which the individual acquires various habits, knowledge, and attitudes that are necessary to meet the demands of life in general. Now, children, the key characteristics of the learning process are: when described in the simplest possible manner, learning is described as an experience acquisition process. It means learning is a process of acquiring experience. In the complex form, learning can be described as process of acquisition, that is acquiring, retention and change of experience. It establishes the relationship between a stimulus and response. Next, it is a method of problem solving and is concerned with making adjustments with the environment. It involves all those gamut of activities, means all those range of activities which may have a relatively permanent effect on the individual. The process of learning is concerned about experience acquisition, retention of experiences, and experience development in a step-by-step manner. Synthesis of both old and new experiences for creating a new pattern. Children, learning is concerned about cognitive, and affective aspects. Now, cognitive relates to the mental processes. Cognitive, it relates to purposeful but not necessarily rational actions. And affective relates to moods, feelings, and attitudes. Knowledge acquisition process is cognitive. Any change in emotions is affective, and cognitive is acquisition of new habits or skills. Now, next, children, how learning takes place. There has been a major issue since many decades, and various methods have been developed by learning psychologists to explain how learning takes place. Theories of learning explain the learning process mainly. The learning theories can be classified into two groups on the basis of their approaches. First is the stimulus response theory, which is supported by Thorndike, Pavlov, Skinner, Hull, Guter, etc. Next is the cognitive theory, which is supported by Kohler, Kafka, Tolman, Levin, etc. Now, children, the SR theorists argue that learning occurs by habit due to a chain of reflexes. The organism learns to perform an activity by repeating the performance, which brings the correct response or which leads one to reach the goal. This sort of learning process, according to them, takes place purely mechanically due to habit, due to stimulus response association. It does not require the understanding, the brain, the intelligence of the learner. Now, paradoxically, the cognitive theorists, they stress on the role of organism variable in any learning. They argue that for any learning process to continue, intelligence, understanding, cognitive structure, etc., they play an important role. Thus, they lay stress on the role of brain process in learning, and they lay stress on the means and the end and understanding of the situation as a whole. Now, children, let's study about classical conditioning. Now, before we study about classical conditioning, you should know conditioning simply means learning. Okay? And conditioning in behavioral psychology is a theory that the response to a stimulus by a person can be modified by learning. Okay? Now, children, classical conditioning, it was I.P. Pavlov, an eminent Russian physiologist and a Nobel Prize winner for his work on physiology of digestion. While experimenting on the gastric secretion in dogs, he observed that any stimulus frequently associated with the presentation of food, it aroused salivation in the dog. This observation led to the famous conditioned response theory of learning. Now, Pavlov noticed that an incident stimulus was sufficient to bring salivation. Then, his attention was diverted to the possibility of producing saliva to an unnatural stimulus. Like trial and error conditioning deals with certain basic principles of learning process, it holds that the formation of stimulus response connection, its strengthening or weakening, it depends upon the association between two things. Now, presentation of a stimulus arouses a response in every normal organism. When you see a friend, you welcome him, and when you see a snake, you run away from it. Sight of food arouses salivation. Here, friend, snake, and food are natural or unconditioned stimuli. And responses like welcome, running away, and saliva are natural or unconditioned responses. Unconditioned means unlearned responses, they are natural. However, when an unnatural conditioned stimulus is frequently associated with a natural or unconditioned stimulus, the organism starts showing his conditioned response to the stimulus. Now, the conditioned response here is equal to the unconditioned response, that is saliva. In other words, saliva is the natural response to food. If food is associated with bell for several trials, bell alone brings out saliva. In short, due to the association between the unconditioned, that is food, and conditioned stimulus, bell. The response to the conditioned stimulus, bell, in the same way, saliva, as he responds to the unconditioned stimulus. This is called conditioned response learning. In case of Pavlov's dog, bell is the conditioned stimulus, okay, and saliva is the conditioned response. Conditioning is supposed to be a process by which a response, here saliva, is attached to a stimulus, that is bell, different from the one which originally elicits that response. What was the earlier stimulus? That was the food. In simple words, a response is said to be a conditioned when some stimulus other than the already effective one come to arouse or modify it for the establishment of a definite stimulus response connection. A non effective stimulus therefore brings an effective response to conditioning, that is, learning. This pattern of behavior is observed when learning by conditioning is complete. Now, let's take the examples to make it clear. The nipple in the mouth of an infant is an unconditioned stimulus, and sucking is an unconditioned reflex. But when the sight of the bottle produces sucking response in the baby, it is called conditioned response, or we can say that is called as learned response. Similarly, happiness at the sight of friends, letters, and crying at the sight of the doctor, there are certain examples of conditioned responses. When an injection needle pricks the muscle of the baby, he cries out of pain. Next time, when he only sees the needle or the doctor, he cries with the anticipation that the needle would now prick him. Here, the pricking of the needle is the unconditioned stimulus. Crying is the unconditioned response. Sight of the needle is the conditioned stimulus, and crying is the conditioned response. Strengthening of the stimulus response connection therefore depends upon the association between two stimuli. The conditioning technique developed by Pavlov is famous as the classical conditioning technique. The following experiment conducted by Pavlov on a dog is known as the classical conditioning experiment. Pavlov made a minor surgical operation in the cheek of the dog to measure the rate of salivation. The dog was kept in a soundproof room. During the experiment, a servant was feeding the dog. To Pavlov's great surprise, he noticed that one day only the sound of the footsteps of the servant made the dog to salivate. The very incident created such an interest in Pavlov that he devoted much of his time to study the phenomena of conditioning, that is, learning. To start with the experiment, when food was placed in the mouth of the dog, it brought saliva. On other occasions, only a bell was rung, but it did not bring any salivary response from the dog. Then Pavlov rang the bell first, and after an interval of 5 seconds, placed the food in the mouth of the dog. In this first trial bell alone, uh, that did not bring saliva until food was not placed in its mouth. It was only after the repetition of the bell being rung and the food being presented, when this sequence was followed for several days, it is only then that the dog could connect the bell with the food and anticipated food at the sound of the bell. And then it salivated to the bell only, even before seeing the food. Pavlov noticed that the dog salivated to the presentation of the bell only after several trials, when learning by conditioning was firmly established. From this, Pavlov inferred that stimulus response connection had been established. The dog had finally learned to respond to the conditioned stimulus. This technique of establishing a response to a conditioned or artificial stimulus is called classical conditioning process. Pavlov, in course of his many experiments, demonstrated that the dog can be made to salivate to any stimulus, however unnatural and irrelevant it may be. This discovery of Pavlov made a significant contribution to the learning theory. So, children, with this, I come to the end of the explanation for today. I hope you have understood what learning means and how it takes place, and also about classical conditioning. So, children, now next your homework is to do the questions given below in your fair notebook. Please do take the help of the book as well as the slides to write your answers. So, that is all for today. Thank you, children.